For leading risk intelligence, think Refinitiv World Check, helping you to identify red flags, fulfill your Know Your Customer and due diligence screening, and comply with regulation. Powered by 20 years of trusted data, technology and human expertise in over 65 languages, with 50,000 new records added every month. To lead the fight against financial crime, it takes more than risk intelligence alone. It takes collaboration. From money laundering, to human trafficking, to terrorism financing. Financial crime is in every corner of the world. So are we, helping you fight it.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Keesa Schreane, and welcome to the Refinitiv Perspectives live stream. As always, we encourage you to follow Refinitiv and subscribe to the Perspectives blog newsletter. Tomorrow is Human Rights Day, and today we're going to be highlighting the challenges and issues of slavery and what organizations, governments, and companies can do to eradicate it. Earlier in the year, the European Commissioner for Justice committed to develop legislation by 2021 that would require European companies to carry out environmental and human rights due diligence in their supply chains. In fact, the US, Germany, Switzerland, and the EU are in the process of establishing human rights due diligence policies. And as we've explored in a previous episode, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a number of global companies that had been found to be using slavery within their supply chains. Joining us today is the global head of financial crime and industry affairs at Refinitiv, Che Sidanius, senior analyst at C4DS, Irina Bukharin. And we are also privileged today to be joined by former UN Special Advisor and CEO of the Freedom Seal, Rani Hong. Thank you all for joining.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So, Che, starting with you, we know that in areas where there is high corruption, there is also a high likelihood of human trafficking and other social injustices. Companies are trying to combat this on both fronts, but how has Refinitiv been working to identify and highlight jurisdictions where modern day slavery is still being used in supply chains?
Thank you, Keesa, and it's great to see you and great to see Irina and Rani on such an important topic. So I guess to answer your question and just to highlight, again, this is the 20th year that we are celebrating fighting financial crime, and human trafficking sits very much at the heart of one of those issues that we are committed to doing better as a community. So I think there's a few things how we are making our effort trying to really change and organize and influence policy levels and engage in a much more effective way. The first is to raise awareness that human trafficking still is an incredibly important problem for us to solve. It's estimated that there's over 40 million people, most of whom are women and children, who are caught in this issue, and there's much more that we need to be doing in this space. The second is to collaborate better and to use data in a much more effective way. And that's why I'm so pleased to work with Rani, the Freedom Seal, and her organization in how we can collaborate in a better way to really highlight where do the criminals operate, which jurisdictions are they connected to, and then of course engage with policymakers as well to ensure that information sharing and collaboration is not only encouraged, but there's policy that can actually encourage and promote those types of relationships and those types of partnerships. So those are just quick examples in terms of what we're doing at the moment at Refinitiv, and working very much, look forward to working with Irina's organizations and many others in how we can combat this issue.
And Che, you bring up a fascinating point that over 40 million people are really the faces of human trafficking. And Rani, we know that you understand these atrocities firsthand. Many of us know your story, but could you share your background as well as your objectives around solving this crisis?
Absolutely. Good morning to all. Just as my personal story, I was raised in India, and at the age of 7 is when I was kidnapped from my mother and stolen and sold into slavery. We're talking about a 7-year-old child being sold across the state borders in southern India. And at that point, my broker, my trafficker, actually was running a company, and he was in that process, and he was using children for slave labor, among other things. So this is the reality. When Che talks about a number, and it is, I'm one of those numbers, and my life was so bad that I basically shut down at the age of 7, couldn't really communicate, couldn't walk, just because of everything that happened to me. But then, so my trafficker sold me from India to Canada, and then Canada into the United States. So we call it the destination, the source and the destination countries. And so today, that's where today I live here in Seattle, Washington area. But my story isn't unique. Millions of children like myself, the little girl I was, imprisoned and silenced, are trafficked. So today is exciting because we're talking about solutions, right? We're talking about this panel, how can we all come together and solve this problem? And I think one of the things that needs to be done is, how do we track these traffickers and the prosecution? Prosecution is low. My trafficker did get jail time, but it took a long time. So I guess I just tell you a short story, a small version of my story, but there again are millions of little girls I was, and this is why we're here today, to ask for all of our audience to join in the fight to fight modern slavery.
Sure, absolutely. And to expound more on those numbers and the data behind it, we'd like to share with our audience right now a compelling video that really illustrates the numbers and the data around human trafficking. Here it is. So that really, seeing the country listed there, is really impactful. Would love to talk about how we could start to activate government in countries to eradicate this. Would you like to start, Rani?
Sorry, Keesa, who was the question to?
Sure, would love to talk about the way we could start to get governments to eradicate this. And Rani, I know you've worked with the UN, and so we'd love to get your thoughts on how we could really work with governments to eradicate this.
Yeah, absolutely. governments play a key role, right? If we need the governments to support, especially the advocacy work. And for me, as the CEO of the Freedom CO, my primary goal is now, how do we get this issue in front of governments? Governments have listened, they've taken action, but we also now need the companies involved as well. So I think that there are several opportunities, and I'm here in the US, and I know there's a legislation just now going in front of the US Congress, waiting for the bill to be signed. So we want to encourage everybody to ask these governments to create these laws, because without the laws, traffickers use the weakness in the systems. Mm-hmm. So if we don't have a law in the country, traffickers see that as a green light. We can get away with crime. So that is why governments play a key role. United Nations, as I did several speeches before the UN General Assembly. Governments committed to fighting forced labor in the supply chains. So now is the time. How do we implement this, and how do we get the laws, more laws passed in several different countries? Right now, there's about 7 countries that have passed it, but we have 150 countries to go. So that's what we need to do.
Okay, getting more laws passed and really getting governments involved with regulations there. Irina, I want to bring you in. Could you talk to us about the work that C4DS does and explain how it fits within the context of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing us all together here today. So C4DS is a nonprofit research organization, and we use publicly available information to map, track, and disrupt transnational illicit networks. So that ranges from proliferation networks to wildlife traffickers, but it also includes human trafficking and forced labor. And so, as we know, forced labor exists in supply chains, but that means that the perpetrators need to be doing basically all the regular things that regular businesses and supply chains do. So they're registering as legal entities, they're sending goods through trade systems, advertising their products, and all of those things are pieces of sort of data footprints that we can piece together and share with law enforcement, with media, with advocacy groups to really sort of put together those pictures of where's forced labor happening and how is that connecting to global supply chains. And so one issue that we work on is forced labor in the fishing industry. Fishermen, usually from Southeast Asia, often suffer really terrible conditions, physical abuse. They're not being paid as they fish for the tuna that is ultimately ending up on our plates. And so while this activity can appear really murky, it involves actors from different countries crossing international borders. But at C4EDS, we try to connect those people to the vessels to the products that are eventually ending up on our table. And so fishing is just one of those industries that we apply this type of investigation and research to. And we hope that our work encourages others to do the same.
Great. And talking about industries, the fishing industry, but more broadly industries and the impacts that are going on there, as many of us know, during the peak of the pandemic, we saw so many supply chain failures. Some, in fact, use slavery within manufacturing of various PPEs. What action is needed for corporates and social responsibility activists to really deal with these ongoing supply chain due diligence crises, particularly inside companies? And Che, we can start with you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So I think there's 2 things that need to happen. The first is there needs to be more of a policy focus and enforcement around this activity. And we know from our own third-party supply chain survey that 65% of companies globally know that one of their suppliers or counterparties may be involved with some kind of human trafficking, corruption, or environmental crime. But they also showed in the survey that they really don't do anything about it because the enforcement mechanism isn't really there. But they also indicated that if there was going to be a proportionate enforcement mechanism, that 93% say they would spend energy and focus on this. So I think the enforcement piece is the first. The second, which gets into this, what Irina and Rani are talking about, which is, we need to find a much more effective way for organizations to collaborate on this issue. We sit as a company on data, Irina sits on data, Rani sits on data. It's how we find ways not only to make it available, but also make informed decisions on where these risks, are in jurisdictions. The video that you demonstrated there is something we commissioned about 1.5 years ago, which is the first time that I'm aware that information has ever been displayed in that way, really showing, which jurisdictions do the traffickers operate in, and it's not random. And so I think that's another aspect in terms of how can we use our data to really highlight where are the risky areas, and then what action can companies and law enforcement take really to focus on those areas.
Great. And I'd like to let the audience know that we are open for your questions and look forward to those. So please feel free to send those in. Rani, I know you have a very unique perspective working and partnering with organizations. What have you seen to be some best practices around really bringing corporates in so there is an intentional effort around eradicating this from the corporate side?
Yes, absolutely. Companies are in a great position to be very effective in fighting modern day slavery. As I've spoken with companies, it's been a challenge. It's a challenge because the crime of human trafficking is a hidden, right? It's not easy to see. However, that's not a path to ignore it, right? So one of the things that we best practices, and when I created the Freedom Seal, I took all for best practices from the United Nations to the EU, what's part of the legislation, put it into this project initiative, and asking companies to one, commit to the issue. Let's just get started, right? Commitment is the first thing to do. But then beyond that, how do we create the policies within our companies? And more likely, how do we get the board members of these companies involved? I think that's been a challenge, but we know part of the working with the UK Modern Slavery Act, we know getting board members of companies involved from the beginning is a critical element. So we have to get the buy-in from that level. But then from there, how do we push it down the supply chains, right? How do we ask the suppliers and our vendors to also commit to this issue? And doing the right thing is good business, but it's also, it's going to help the bottom line of the actual companies. So I would ask for commitment, policies, and then the governance, right? So again, the Freedom Seal Initiative outlines those best practices aligned with the current legislation, and we basically ask the companies to adopt the Freedom Seal in order to show publicly the evidence of what they're doing to fight this crime. Great question from our audience here. Proper documentation, ID verification, and tracking of people checked in real time can be a useful application of technology if applied at all points of transfer, transaction, or transport of labor. How can this be enforced? So these points, proper documentation, these points of identifying, how can they be enforced?
So I guess from our perspective, I think we're far from real-time monitoring, but certainly the necessity of proper documentation and ID verification is incredibly important. And then you get into things like there needs to be common data standards, needs to be common reporting standards, and those common data elements and reporting elements, then you need to be able to cross-verify across other jurisdictions. So one example, for instance, is sanctions. There's 65 different sanctions regimes, hundreds of sanctions lists, none of whom have a proper template for what's being reported. So it's very difficult then actually to start comparing. And of course, my name can be spelled in 65 different languages, so of course, that adds a complexity. And I say this in this context of today's discussion because sanctions policy will increasingly be used in the context of human trafficking. We've seen in the UK adopted the Magnitsky Act. The US has followed suit, and the EU now are also going to adopt something similar. So these issues will be not only the enforcement will increase, but that also gets to the point here as far as the question is concerned. That also means that it needs to be a proper framework and a data element framework, so we can actually start comparing these things and managing these issues. And I'll just pause. Lastly, to point that Irina made, which is very important. She mentioned the fisheries as an example. Human trafficking is not an isolated incident. It's not an isolated activity. It's very much linked with issues like corruption, sustainability, and other issues. So criminals are, they're agnostic as far as what activity they get into, as long as it's profitable. So I think that's another element that we as a company that we also want to highlight, that we have to start looking at the human trafficking as a very much cross risk, a multidimensional aspect that we need to tackle as well.
Migrants, people who are leaving from one country to another country, people who are being displaced from their homes for various reasons, climate change might be part of that, but for various reasons, are falling victim to trafficking as it relates to supply chains. What can governments do to help avoid people being absorbed into use for financial crime?
I guess I can kick this one off, but very interested to hear what Che and Rani have to say. I think with migrants and displacement, what we see is that these people are at much higher risk when the receiving country is not welcoming of them and is not providing them with the services that they need to, live with basic needs met and live with some dignity. And that really puts them at much higher risk of falling victim to various trafficking supply chains. It also, of course, if they end up in a country where there's a higher risk of human trafficking, they are therefore themselves then at higher risk. And so I think focusing on those sort of pain points, both in our general systems of human trafficking, but then also where migrants or people that have been displaced are, not being welcomed, I think that's really something that has to be examined as a potential lead-in to, forced labor and human trafficking.
Rani, I want to pose to you, I'm sure some people would say, well, there is a cost when people come from one area to another area. Where are they going to be employed? Where are they going to live? When those questions arise, what is your response?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think I love the statement that the Refinitiv had said in the past, saying that there's a cost. Yeah, right. We see human trafficking, we see the numbers, but end of the day, there's a cost to a human life. You take it from my own example. And again, that's how my traffickers got away. We talk about, because yes, they gave me a false passport. They gave me a false visa. So they falsified my documentation, and that is how they got away and how I got into these different countries. So we take it from the human perspective. And now today, as we know, migrants are at a huge risk. And when a migrant gets to the other country, it is not what was told in their contract, right? It's again, the reality is low pay, terrible working conditions. So these migrants find themselves just helpless. And I've worked with lots of different migrants and people who've been, former victims of forced labor. And I hear from them, I hear their stories, and I hear their pain as real cost. And so that is why governments do have a role. And I'm happy to say I have worked with the International Office of Migration. In fact, I was just talking to a couple UN agencies just on the migration from Latin America into the United States. So if we look at those examples, migrants, when they arrive in the country and when the traffickers basically hold them against their will, and then they can't get employment, right? They can't get employment because these are false documentations. And so now they have to survive in these new countries. And none of us, it's difficult when you have no documentation, no support, no family support. And then when the traffickers take advantage of the situation, that's where we say governments have to get involved and look at the situation of these migrants and see how can they play a role in helping these migrants move forward.
So I know we're talking about people who are living in one area, moving to another area. As we look at how to eradicate this type of slavery, is it different when we look at it from a global perspective versus a local perspective? So are there different issues at stake? Are there different ways that governments need to engage when it's local as opposed to looking at it from a global perspective? Is global the only way to look at it because it is a global issue? What are your thoughts in terms of dealing with it locally and from a global perspective?
Yeah, no, I guess I can kick that off. No, it's a wonderful question, right? In the sense that this is a complex issue, and and it's there's multidimensional and many actors at play. So I guess I'll take a stab at the question. So from a local perspective, this is really around how government agencies, as a start, can start to cooperate a bit better. And I'm talking here about customs unions, immigration officers, law enforcement, the judiciary. So even at that local level, I think most countries, if not all, have some work to do in terms of collaborating better. From a global perspective, there's a number of venues and platforms that are discussing this as well. And that's, the UN, of course, which Rani is part of, the B20 that we were part of, the European Commission. There's many different policy bodies that are trying to address this on a global perspective, but they can only enforce policies that are conducive. But at the end of the day, the local authorities, the local companies need to have the resources, priorities, and focus to actually address it at the local level, while at the same time, trying to do more to collaborate at a global level.
Great. Irina, do you have thoughts there? And Rani will give you the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Che is right on the money that enforcement at sort of every level is really the linchpin of getting over the hump. But I think that doesn't limit what can be done to solely governments, as we've discussed today. Everyone has a role to play, from the companies, and then the consumers that are buying from those companies really have a voice, and both a voice in the literal sense and a vote with their where they're spending their money. And so I think application of those avenues of action are possible for everybody to do.
And Rani will give you the last word here on global versus local.
Yeah, no, great question. And as 20 years of working in this space, I've heard several stories. But so a lot of times the blame is, well, it happened over in another country. It's an international problem. And so we hear that, right? However, so what happens, it's both. It's international problem, but it's very much of a local problem. So, but the two don't connect, right? So some of the challenges we see is that the international doesn't talk to the local, and then the migrant, in this case, may get stuck in that between. So we do have to have a coordinated response. Again, coordinated response to this issue it is a must, right? So when the international and the local don't speak, that's when, again, this leaves the criminals to be able to do their work. So I think for us to be able to help solve that problem, I did put that as part of the Freedom Seal. We have a migrant certification component of it, which puts the best practices on what to do, for what companies can do to prevent forced labor and using migrants and all that within their supply chain.
Well, when we talk about human trafficking and slavery, there are actual faces behind those concepts. 40 million faces, actually, many of them women and children. One way that corporations can really look to engage and eradicate this is to focus on committing to doing it, first of all, focus on policy, and really ensuring that board members are involved from that top level on down. Also, governments can really, from our conversations, can engage on this and eradicate it by ensuring that laws are in place first and foremost, and then engaging with organizations that map and track these trafficking and forced labor networks to get an understanding of where they are and to get an understanding of what needs to be done and where it needs to be done. So being very intentional about collaboration and partnership is key. Fantastic info. Che, Irina, and Rani, thank you so much for joining for such a needed conversation here.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you so much to our audience as well. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to learn more, you can request more details on the work Refinitiv is doing to fight financial crime by using the link or scanning the QR code on the screen now. As always, thank you for joining us. And on behalf of our fantastic director, Robert Cobble, and everyone at the Refinitiv Perspectives live stream, we wish you happy holidays and a tremendously wonderful 2021. Be well.